Okay, everybody, welcome to my channel. I'm Roger. I want to talk today about the Overton window and how it relates to the candidacy of Marianne Williamson. And I'm not sure, again, who watches these videos or, um, what kind of basis do I need when I talk? Do I need to define terms or what kind of schema do I need? So I'm not certain. So what I've decided to do here is give a very basic definition of the Overton window. So the Overton window is basically what it refers to is a range of what is acceptable to the public and what people are comfortable discussing. So, for example, if I went out into MSNBC or to the town square or CNN or whatever, and I began suggesting that we should mm, treat our former presidents the same way that we treated Nazi war criminals, that would probably not be acceptable, not just to the elites, but to maybe a majority of the population. So that's outside of the range of comfort and viability that the public would expect. The reason that this term matters is because progressives in the last 10 years have been arguing that, in particular, Bernie Sanders' candidacy has expanded the Overton window, made both politicians and people more comfortable with discussing primarily two policies, um, Medicare for All and the Green New Deal. And they continue to use this idea to justify running more progressive candidates in future presidential elections. And now they're starting to use it to justify maybe running Marianne Williamson. So first, I want to deal with that, um, because the background of this is that in the last four cycles, we've had someone who ostensibly presents themselves as a progressive. That was in 2008, Barack Obama. I'm not going to go off on a tangent here and discuss his disappointing presidency, although I can point to certain specific things, which I may make videos on in the future, like his support of uh, a government program which incentivized foreclosing on people's homes, which made the then Great Recession even worse. And there are many examples of broken promises and strange policies. Uh, but uh, suffice it to say, for people on the liberal wing of the Democratic Party and beyond to the left, he was uh, either part of the system and an extension of Ronald Reagan, or at least a very big disappointment. And this matters because I want in particular, draw the background here, the historical background of these primaries. So he runs as an insurgent, a progressive, in the 2008 primaries, beats Hillary Clinton. Then he runs basically unopposed in 2012. Then in 2016, Hillary Clinton barely manages to beat back the other insurgent candidate in recent memory, the anti establishment Bernie Sanders. And Bernie loses, right? And so a lot of the progressives in the party, they had their hope in him. And he loses. Immediately, he tries to use his newfound celebrity status to gain certain things. First, he fails to put in Congressman Ellison as an ally at the DNC. He fails to change the official positions of the Democratic Party. He doesn't really get rid of the super delegates. They're still there, but in a muted form, but they're still there. And then he runs again, and gets sliced and diced, even worse, in 2020, despite being the first candidate in history to either tie first or win the first three primaries. He still manages to lose. Okay, now this is really, really important because it gives you a little bit of background into why Marianne Williamson can't win. Now, that's the history. So, why am I so down on Williamson's candidacy? Well, putting my ideology aside, since now I'm a left libertarian, putting that aside, uh, and not talking about her as a liberal or her disappointing stances in foreign policy or something like that, let's just look at the raw politics, not the policy, but the politics, the numbers, or what we can ascertain. Like Kamala Harris, Marianne Williamson, has never won a primary. Okay? So she doesn't have any delegates. She has very little political experience. She hasn't really been a governor or a senator or elected to Congress. Her background is as a wedding officiant and a spiritual advisor, which I don't know exactly what that means. It might be psychic. I don't know. She uses phrases and terminology and sayings which appear kooky. And she has about 1/200th the name recognition and charisma of one Bernie Sanders. So, just from a political perspective, her candidacy makes no rational sense. There is very little, if actually, there's no data to support her candidacy, just in terms of raw numbers. Instead, some people like Kulinski and Ball have made arguments that are basically speculation. Now, let me explain this because it's really important. The idea that Marianne Williamson is going to run in the primary and expand the Overton window more, or somehow pressure an incumbent president from the left, is complete and utter nonsense. The reason it is because it's actually harder to run against an incumbent president in that president's own party than it is to unseat an incumbent president in the general election, which sometimes happens. It's happened, I believe, 3 times in my life. I've never heard of a president losing a primary. It just does not happen. So it would be harder for her to beat Biden than for Bernie to have beaten Joe or Hillary. I repeat that. It's actually harder to beat an incumbent president in the primary. And to think that she could be effective in pressuring Biden and pushing him to the left when a sitting United States Senator, again, Bernie Sanders, can't even do that. He can't even stop a $4.5 trillion giveaway to the rich right before or right after the COVID shutdown of the economy. The idea that she's going to suddenly break all expectations and fundraise with enough tenacity to pose any kind of threat to a sitting U.S. president is sheer fantasy. It is sheer fantasy at this point. And let me be 100% clear on it. These people, like Crystal Ball and Kyle Kulinski, and anyone else who's entertaining this, I'm not sure of the breadth of personalities, but there's some. They know full well that she has no chance. And the reason that they're pushing this is because they need someone to push. so that their numbers will go up. And I'm talking about their viewership and their Patreon numbers. That's what this is really about. Now, of course, there's going to be a steep price for them to pay, not just in lost credibility when she goes down in flames, but also a steep price in terms of actually increasing the numbers of someone that they claim that they disagree with, which is Jimmy Dore. Jimmy Dore and RBN, the Revolutionary Blackout Network, these are people, it's debatable how leftist they are in the case of Jimmy Dore, but in the case of RBN, they're leftists, and they're critical of Marianne Williamson's candidacy, and they're critical of the Democratic Party, and they're critical of progressives. And what's going to happen is their numbers are going to go up as well. So this is just more hot air and doesn't make any political sense whatsoever. Again, forgetting about the policy, the idea that she's going to run a successful candidacy in the Democratic Party is just complete nonsense. Worse than that, some other point I want to hit is that the Democrats have moved the South Carolina primary to the first primary on the calendar. Now, why would they do that? Well, they figured out that there are a lot of black people in South Carolina, so they can make the argument that they're trying to listen to the diverse voices out there in the Democratic Party. Even though that doesn't really mean anything, because that would require black voters and older black voters to demand change, and older black voters do not demand that. So that's a meaningless statement. And number two, they realized not only can they count on these voters to vote for the emptiest suit, i.e., Biden or whatever conservative Democrat comes down the pike, but it's going to make it nearly impossible for a progressive to run successfully, because Marianne Williamson, if she runs, she's going to get killed in South Carolina. And that's going to shorten the amount of time that she has to raise money. Because once she gets killed in that primary, whatever the second primary is, which I believe at the moment is New Hampshire, she's going to not have that momentum coming into New Hampshire. Whereas before, she might have had a chance if she were to campaign in the caucuses, because caucuses work a little bit different than primaries. She could schmooze with the farmers, etc. Or in New Hampshire, she could talk to them one-on-one. That buoyance, that whatever that is, coming out of Iowa is not going to exist. She's just going to get murdered in South Carolina, which is a larger state in a lot of ways, or larger than New Hampshire, certainly, and in some ways harder to transverse than Iowa. So she's just not going to have any momentum at all, and no progressive would in the next cycle in 2028. So this moving of South Carolina to first on the primary calendar is a very cynical ploy by the conservative side, the corporate side of the Democratic Party. I say that comparatively speaking, of course, because at this point, all Democrats are corporate, whether we want to face that reality or not. However, just from the practical point of view, anyone running as an insurgent candidate is going to lose. Again, let's look at the history. Why was Barack Obama the nominee in 2008? Because he won in the Iowa caucuses. By moving this around, it becomes impossible for an insurgent candidate to win. So, taken all together, just to recap, it is thoroughly impossible for me to believe that Crystal Ball actually literally thinks that Marianne Williamson, that Marianne Williamson has a shot. Maybe she has deluded herself Maybe. Or maybe it's easy to delude yourself when your career is on the line. I mean, these YouTubers have a career. It involves selling people, selling issues, getting eyeballs to watch, and not having a progressive to point to give recaps of how this particular candidate did on this particular day. Not having that is scary to them. It's very frightening for a progressive to think we're not going to have someone to run. We have to have someone to run. And that goes to show how bad the state of the American left is, that they're hooked to electoralism and to trying to run a candidate in a system that is basically designed for them to fail and designed for progress to fail. So that's it for today. Please like and subscribe and give me some feedback, and share the video, and I will talk to you guys in the future. Bye-bye.